All right. Hello, everyone. I think you can hopefully hear and see me at this point. My name is Amanda Zink from the International Republican Institute, and I'm excited to welcome all of you to Code for All's 2023 Summit. I'm joining on behalf of the Technology and Democracy team at IRI, which, for those of you who are not familiar, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing democracy worldwide, and we have operations in over 100 countries. So we're really, really excited to be a part of this conversation and discussion today, and are grateful to Code for All for hosting us and for organizing this summit. This year holds a really special place in the civic tech community's heart, as Code for All is commemorating its 10th anniversary, culminating in its 4th annual online summit. Whether you're a familiar face or just a first-time participant, you should know that the 2023 summit is more than just an event. It's a global convergence that the Code for All's core team, along with their 31 member organizations, curates each year to foster unity within the global civic tech community. To celebrate their 10th anniversary, the network is kicking off a crowdfunding campaign and is turning to their amazing community with a heartfelt ask. So throughout the duration of the summit, you'll have a chance to chip in any amount that feels right for you and your organization. Your support is critical in keeping the unity and empowerment of both the Code for All network and the Code for All Summit alive. So in the screen and the chat, we will share the link where you can directly contribute to amplifying Code for All's mission and propelling their efforts in the years to come. So please keep an eye out for that link and contribute if you're able. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we do get started. I want to flag that during the session today, we'll be hearing from each of our speakers. Following this, we'll have a group discussion among all of the panelists, and then the room will open up for Q&A from the audience at the end. So please do be thinking of questions over the course of the panel. We will make time for them before this session concludes. If you would like to ask any questions during this webinar, please type them into the chat window on YouTube live streaming. We'll do our best to address them during the conversation. And then finally, a recorded version of this webinar will be available at codeforall.org and on our YouTube channel for future watching in case any of your colleagues are not able to join. So with all of that behind us, I want to now jump into the session and the great content that we have to cover today. As a reminder, hopefully you're all in the right session. Today, it is the session that we're in right now is called Success Beyond Launch, Monitoring and Evaluation to Inform Longer-Term Success. And it's really all focused on fostering a conversation and sharing best practices about what metrics can be used to help inform the success of a civic tech initiative beyond the launch, and how you can use those metrics to inform adaptations that will make your work more successful in the long term. I personally think this is a really important topic, and it's a topic that the Technology and Democracy team at IRI has been really focused on, as we've been trying to better understand what can help digital initiatives and the civic and govtech organizations behind them sustain in the longer term. I also know that this is a topic that can often be overlooked, especially because many civic tech teams are small with limited bandwidth or have limited resources to begin with. And we've seen monitoring and evaluation practices often are some of the first to fall to the wayside. So this session will hopefully create a space where you all can learn about key tips and best practices to help you integrate MEL into your work, even if you have a small team. And also will just help to emphasize how important MEL really can be. So with all of that said, I don't want to take up too much more time. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three speakers, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So first, I'd like to introduce Colombina Schaefer. She is a sociologist with a PhD in Government and International Relations from the University of Sydney. She has researched democracy, civic participation, environmental movements, social movements, and the relationship between science and technology. Since 2017, she's served as Ciudadanía Inteligente's Deputy Director. Next, I'd like to introduce John Griffin. John has been in the role of Program Manager of Open North's Community Solutions Network program for the past year. And he's been working with municipalities and communities on challenges around data and digital transformation. Prior to this role, John worked in MEL, both in Canada, working with governments across Canada, as well as abroad and international development roles as well. Finally, we have Khairul Yusuf with us. He is the coordinator at Sinar Project, a civil society organization based in Malaysia, and is an independent investigative journalist working on applying innovative methods of open data and standards for transparency and anti-corruption. Khairul has over a decade of extensive cross-practice and cross-sector experience implementing programs for UN agencies, governments, and civil society in Asia Pacific for topics such as civic tech, e-governance, knowledge management, and human rights. So we have a true panel of experts with us here today. Thanks so much to all three of you for joining us in your various time zones. So I want to go ahead and jump into it. And John, I actually want to start with you. I know you've led MEL efforts across multiple different organizations and contexts spanning Canada and Ghana, and have been a bit of a champion for MEL through Code for All and various other outlets in the past as well. So I want to kick it off with a bit of a higher level perspective. Can you share, based on your past experiences, how you define MEL, how you define monitoring and evaluation, what your top 3 best practices would be for strong MEL, and why you think MEL matters, especially for organizations in the long term? So over to you, John.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm happy to be here. Always enjoy participating in these. I think this is my 3rd time at a Code for All Summit. So I think for me, MEL is really around like sort of understanding the role your initiative or like action project plays in achieving a specific outcome or outcomes, whether those are intended or not, and then iterating based on those findings. So I think it kind of helps thinking about those sort of like 3 best practices. I think this kind of helps break that apart a little bit. For me, like the starting one, and I think this will be really familiar for a lot of folks, is around having like a properly defined problem and goal. Obviously, if those ideas are really nebulous, it's kind of hard to measure against something when we're constantly like changing or adapting a problem or goal that we're working towards. Around the problem, the important thing there is not only just like getting to an understanding, but validating that. So figuring out who you need to validate that with, and then the next step there being, why is this problem still unsolved? Like what's the challenge that's preventing that? Those 2 pieces I think are really big in understanding that. And then in terms of the goal, it's the direction that you're ultimately going. And both these things need to be referred to consistently throughout your MEL process. So it's not, okay, we have the goal, we have the problem, we don't need to look at those again. Like throughout that process, keep looking back. Are what we're measuring, are what we're finding, do these speak to that problem? Do these move us towards this goal? So that would be my first best practice. The second one is having clear measurable indicators that speak to your goal or problem, not your solution. So this is probably hit a little close to home for a lot of folks who've worked in this space. I know I have many experiences that this brings me back to, but when we talk about indicators, there's a real tendency to measure our solution as opposed to progress towards our goal. So what that means is we may be running workshops to build capacity, and instead of creating indicators around capacity building, our primary indicators is around how many workshops did we run? How many people showed up to those workshops? And in some instances, those things are important, but those aren't our main indicators. We're not running a project to run more workshops. That's not our goal. But all too often, especially in when Mel is sort of dominated from a funder perspective, those are the things that we really tend to latch onto. And at that point, really all we're doing is monitoring the work that's being done, not the progress towards a goal. So just, I think a thing that is really helpful for me to keep in mind, and it's really not just limited to Mel, but like Mel is not monitoring that your staff and volunteers are doing work. And again, so that means like we're not using our primary deliverables to be like, how many workshops did we run? How many reports did we write? How many like interviews were held? These shouldn't be our primary indicators. And that's a tough one, I think, for a lot of folks to get over, but is really important. Practice number 3, and this connects really to my last point there, which is that Mel is everyone's job and shouldn't feel like anyone's job. And so that's maybe a little over convoluted, but this is a summit, and so I felt it kind of needed to be a little catchy. But really what I mean there is every single person in your organization is collecting data, is using data. And like, I mean every single person. And so if you only have a single person or a team, they're responsible for your Mel activities, and it's very clear, like everything Mel is done here, you're gonna miss stuff, and that's just a given. And this doesn't mean it's bad to have a Mel team. That's great if you have the capacity to have that. But as long as it's understood that the work being done within your Mel process is being done by everyone in the organization. And what I mean by saying it also shouldn't feel like anyone's job is if it's a big additional load you're putting on all staff, you're not going to probably make it very far. I can take a wild guess and assume that no one here's team is sort of looking around saying like, yeah, I could definitely do 3 more hours of work each week. And so we really want to stay away from that and find what are the day-to-day, week-to-week activities that staff are doing that lend themselves to malpractices. And so I know for our team, we conduct a lot of calls and interviews with government staff. And so those are existing part of staff responsibilities. And just simply adding, okay, well, after each call, we summarize those calls and we create a little summary that we can share out to staff. That's great, right? Because then we're actively disseminating that knowledge across the organization. And it doesn't really feel like a big lift for anybody to spend 5-10 minutes after a call, just making sure they review and summarize that information. And in terms of why Mel matters in the long term, I think what I'd like to focus on there really quickly is just simply that it matters in the long term, not just for like the project you're working on, but for like, and not just for your organization, but for everybody. I think there's a real tendency to focus on, sorry for the noise in the background, but focus on projects or focus on indicators that we can immediately adapt to and be like, oh, well, those ones, there's nothing we can do about that. But you're in a really good spot maybe to collect that information where others can't. And those learnings, especially if you can make those public and share those with the wider community, that's what you're going to build upon. Because like most of the people here, everyone's working on really big, lofty goals. These aren't, as a former colleague used to say, like, delivering the next app to sell avocados better, right? Like we're talking about things like democracy and climate. And so that work is really just built on top of everybody else's work. And so when you conduct Mel, it's not just for your project. It's what have we learned that we can share with others so this work continues further along.
Thanks so much, John. I think those are all really phenomenal points and points that we have seen in our own work as an 800 plus organization internally. These are truths that we still have really recognized in terms of the systems that we put in place. And we've seen this hold true for our partners as well. So I think those are 3 really great points. And maybe we can return to some of the nuance of what you said there. But I want to return to Columbina next, because I know that you've had a really interesting experience of starting at an organization where the malpractices were originally not quite systematized, and the focus was really more on providing data to funders for specific projects. So I know over the course of 2 years, or multiple years, you have helped oversee the organization's transition towards using organizational level indicators, and we're actually able to institutionalize them for longer term use. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how you were able to achieve that. How were you able to kind of move through that transition? And many smaller organizations, I know, often aren't really sure where to start. So if you could talk about what that experience looked like, what that transition looked like, I think it would be really helpful for many who are on the call.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you for the session. I think it's very nice to be able to talk about this, because some people think that this is very boring, or like, no, male practices, we don't want to do that, but it's essential to our work. So if I manage to do this correctly, I put some points here that I will share with you. So, oh, it's working. Yes. So yeah, as you were saying, I started in 2017 in Ciudadanía Inteligente as deputy director. And at the beginning, my job was more to understand how much work we did, because usually we organizations like ours was like in the peak of growing as an organization, and we didn't know how much we work with it, and we had a lot of issues of how much can we commit, too many projects, how much people we need. But that, I don't know, because this all was done very, very slowly. And I agree a lot with John's points. You will see while I talk why. But you cannot do everything from the beginning. So at the beginning it was more, and we got a lot of help from our board directors and agile methodologies to measure how much work we did and how much work a project needed. So it was more oriented towards management. And we were doing the mistakes that John said, like counting how many workshops we did, but it was a start, like at least to know this, like to have information on what we did. And not only for the funders, because as you were saying at the beginning, all the reporting that was done was the reporting to funders, but there was a lot of work that was being done that nobody knew. Wow, or if maybe we had a lot of core funding, and when there was not a specific report on a project we did with core funding, there was no information. So we started very slowly combining these kind of issues and to start to report at least internally. And I did it as deputy director, so I started to do an annual report, working, of course, with all the project coordinators to start to know. And I tried to do it historically, but I started in 2017 what we were doing, and it was not so much oriented toward evaluation of impact or assessment in the terms that John said, but at least to have the information there. Then this proved to be very useful for the sustainability strategy, because there was also, when you are applying to funding, before this, people had to all the time ask, how many of these did we do? How many workshops of these? How many platforms have we built? And all the time do the work again. So this kind of work also had a relationship with the sustainability strategy that we were also starting to implement a more formal one. And with time, because this was 2017, I will say this was 1 or 2 years in this. At the end of 2019, I will say, 2018, 19, we started to look at, instead of only results in terms of management, to start to think about impact. And I will say, and I know probably lots of people will agree with me, it's very difficult to measure impact in NGOs, because if you want to seriously do it, you need to have a control group. So it's not so ambitious as real impact, but at least trying to think more in terms of what is exactly the objective of this project, what do we want to achieve, and are we getting there, and being more ambitious. And it doesn't matter if you don't, but for instance, our mission or purpose is to strengthen democracies. So it's like, how do you measure if you strengthen a democracy? But at least we try to make, when we do indicators of our projects, to think in terms of, okay, one part is to have done what you propose, like what you promised to be done. But this is the basic. But then to think more in terms of impact and to be kind of creatively too, because it's not always easy. And also one thing that we have started to do is, when we apply to funding, to incorporate a consultancy that helps us to do this in the funding strategy, so that we have actually resources to do this, or an external assessment, for instance. And I think it's a collective job, as John also said, but you need someone keeping this warm. And I see this as an investment. So you need to have some person, some role in the organization that does this kind of institutional development work. The other thing is to do it simple, because at the beginning we started working with some spreadsheets that were so complicated that nobody understood how to fill them. And you have to train people to think in these terms. It's not like so obvious, and it's good that to take the time to do it. It's also an investment, but it takes time. So it's not something that you will have the result in 6 months. It will take maybe 1 year, or even a longer term. And then you can achieve something like, it's a culture, I say, of MEL practices that people have incorporated. At the beginning, this was like a fight, I say, people didn't want to do it in our organization. Everyone was saying, why are we doing this? And now everyone, I don't know if they love to do it, but nobody thinks that this is a waste of time. So it has to be simple. And I don't know if you can see it, like an example of the spreadsheets we use. Sorry. So we have the name of the project, the description, the main objective, the specific projective, and not only of the project, but of the area where the project is, because you have to think in terms of the whole organization. And as the directors of the organization, we give goals for the whole year or for 3 years. So the area that has this project has to think in those terms, like, how does my project contribute to this bigger goal? And then you have the project with their main objective, and then we have expected results, goals, indicators, and how to monitor it. And there is where we ask the teams something like, think about 1 or 2 things that you need to accomplish in this 1 year or 2 year project, like the main thing. And then, of course, you can track how many workshops you did, how many presentations, how many people you train, how many persons go inside the website. That's okay. But also to think about how this project contributes to the purpose of the organization. So it's very aligned to actually what John said before. And I will say that you have to take it slowly and take the time to do it, and see it as an investment, because it will help you to do a lot of things in all areas of your organization, not only in terms of MEL practices.
Thank you so much. I think those are all really good points. And I think seeing that example as well, the spreadsheet that you're using, really demonstrates how simple MEL can be. Just having a well-organized Excel spreadsheet can be one of the easiest ways to get started. So thank you so much for sharing how you all have been able to make that shift. I want to now turn to Kyril, who has another example of how MEL has been and can be integrated into organizations' work. And Kyril, I know your organization has been investing in a really innovative approach to collect MEL data, not only for your own organization, but also in support of a wider set of Malaysian civil society organizations. So I'm wondering if you can talk about this initiative, including why you thought it was needed, how it works, and ultimately how you see it helping your organization determine and communicate impact in the longer term. I think your voice may not be coming through. I'm not sure if it's just
okay. I think it's just muted now. Yeah,
there we go.
I think it was, yeah, all right. So yeah, thanks for that. And I think the previous 2 speakers are perfect setup for me. So it's like, we all know it's important. It's also, we all know that we need to capture it, these indicators, and even beyond. But the challenge on the ground for most NGOs is that it's really hard to do this. Especially for, say, in places that are more constrained, where you might have only 2 or 3 staff or volunteer staff doing projects. In addition to your situation, like so one case example in Malaysia is a rapid response grant where they're dealing with death threats and supporting activists, right? So in all of this, late night sessions dealing with emergency situations, it's really hard to think. It's like, oh, I should have put this indicator, or I should have updated this spreadsheet, or I should have updated this table. And so it becomes an added burden, and it becomes stress, as the previous speakers have mentioned. But everybody understands that you need to do this. It's just capacity is difficult. So I've been trying to figure out, like, how can we be able to support partners such as this, and even within our own organizations, to not duplicate efforts, and to simplify this process as much as possible. In order to do that, I actually started coding a simple kind of knowledge sharing platform that's able to not only capture these things on a daily basis, but also capture the required mail information that we need as a one-time task. So I'll just share a little bit of how it looks like. Slides here. Yeah, so I just raised this, right? Just limited capacity and energy. The other challenge is that quite often you capture these in those reports, you report it to donors. Quite often they're lost and forgotten. And yeah, as the previous speakers have shared, it's often as an afterthought and as an additional burden to your task, right? So this is the other challenge, is that as implementers, we often have multiple donors and funders and stakeholders to report to, including our own beneficiaries. And generally, this is how it looks like, right? Multiple tables, reports that we have to fill up multiple times in different formats. And if you are doing it internally, again, there's lots of different systems. You can do spreadsheets. At Sina Project, for example, we had a Trello site to capture some of these things. I have my own internal notes, as you can see how crazy that is with Logsec in terms of all the work that we've done. We got to update a website. Sometimes we have online reporting tools to document and so on. And it's just too difficult. You have multiple entries, duplicate entries, and you have to often enter the same information multiple times. So it often leads to a situation where, you have an amazing report that you submit to someone, but then your website isn't updated. Or again, you do a project report, but then what might happen is that only some parts of what you've done is captured in the report. And then a lot of the learnings and so on, outputs, things that you did as part of the project are not captured and lost, right? So the general capacity for me is that for most of our partners, and including our own organization, you only have time or energy to just update once. So it could be either adding onto a website, or sharing a message, or sending an email. And generally, that's about as much capacity that I've seen people have in the different systems that they use, or different ways that they can share information. So it has to be at minimal, right? And we've seen this in the open data world, in constrained environments where a similar situation happens. Different people work on different things, bits and pieces are missing, or people have different pieces of information. So we need a standardized way of doing this and capturing this information as reusable data from different people. So as a solution to this, I coded an initial kind of knowledge sharing platform to be able to capture these basic outputs and results from multiple partners, but also be able to publish the data through a standard API, so that we can generate all these different reports automatically while entering the data only once. So, and as much as possible, for those who have done a lot of MEL, there's a lot of repetition in terms of the types of reports that you need to do, categorization, thematic work, and so on. So if you only do it once, you can generate these things in different formats, or provide the information that the NGOs in Malaysia need. So I mean, here's the typical example of a report. This is as best capacity in this case, where I mentioned about having a death threat case. There were multiple, news releases, press statements, resources created, training guides, security, and so on, tools being used. And then that was what they were able to capture in the limited amount of energy and time that they had. And then when it comes into the report, it just becomes a narrative report for the donor, and only maybe one of those outputs on the left ends up being mentioned. And as a result, none of these resources were captured or accessible. So what I created was that it's like, okay, can we be in a situation where we just add it once, add all these resources in, either on behalf of the partners, and every time we add those in, be able to tag and add the metadata that we need, whether it's implementing partners, whether it's the status of the activity, which categories does it come in under. And then once we've done this, we'll now be able to not only search and capture all the resources and outputs that are done in support of the partners that we have, but also be able to generate the reports that we need. So just for this process alone so far, yes, it's not kind of at the outcome and impact and changes level, but already in just a week or two of just capturing past reports, we've already been able to capture like over 176 resources. And that the impact of the Malaysian NGOs are actually beyond just the national level, like 9 countries, and the amount of partners we work with is like over 49. In different areas and so on. And we're now able to search and find these things. The next step, of course, is to then be able to add some of these indicators like that used to be, entered in spreadsheets or funded in reports, and see if we can collectively do this such that, again, that we're able to capture outcome and impact for everyone, while having it as a only one-time task whenever we add these resources. So, so that's what I've learned so far in trying to do this.
Thanks, Carol. I think that's a really amazing example. And I think we've had a really interesting picture painted across our 3 panelists about the more basics of MEL, those key best practices, a simpler approach, all the way up to what can be a little bit more complex once you are familiar with MEL in your organization. So I think those are all phenomenal examples. And so I want to turn now to the fuller panel and have some kind of open-ended questions here that anyone is able to jump in on. And I also do want to give a reminder to anyone in the audience tuning in. If you do have any questions, now is the time to drop them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on the chat, and we'll try to integrate them into our conversation as well as they come in. But I want to start with a question that I think all of you have kind of touched on. I think what's interesting is among all 3 of you, you mentioned the importance of simplifying MEL, and also, of taking a whole of organization approach, which can often require a culture shift. I'm wondering if you guys can talk in a little bit more detail about how you've been able to drive culture change at your organizations to encourage your colleagues to actually collect MEL data, because I think this is something my organization internally struggles with, is actually creating that culture shift, and we've seen our partners struggle with as well. So anything you can speak to or share on that point, I think would be very helpful. Feel free to jump in, whoever has a thought first.
I think that the more collective the approach the organization has to work, instead of very hierarchical or in silos, the better. Because in our case, there was a work done not only in MEL practices, as I said, we were working with agility, lean methodologies and agile methodologies, and everyone was received this capacitation in this area. And also, the other thing that we did was when we started to work in the sustainability strategy, we also tried to make it more collective and not only based in one person, because also when that person leaves, it takes all the contacts, all the expertise. So it was a process of collective understanding of the organization. So then anyone could be doing an application and needing this data. So if the data was not there, or then if everyone goes somewhere to present our work and can travel, because we also did a work in terms of feminist practices and looking who is traveling, are they only male, or is only the same people, that kind of things. So if you're going to to travel and go to somewhere to present your work and you're doing the presentation and oh, I don't know how many, how much, how that thing, and then you need the information. So at the first time I did this report, this big report, it was huge. Everyone was like, okay, but then they use it. And the next year was like, where is the report? And they said, okay, if you want the report, you have to help doing it because I don't have the data. You would coordinate the projects. I do nothing and everything. Like a deputy director doesn't do anything in an organization and everything because I don't manage projects. So I think it has to do also with the culture of the organization. And I'm happy to say that at least now our organization has a very collective understanding. And even now we have an executive director and deputy director, but we work as a collegiate body. So we have a decision-making system and it's two people, not one. And that it also makes a difference. And usually projects are coordinated by two people and so on.
John or Kyril, do either of you want to jump in?
Just really quickly, like I think Columbine nailed it completely there, which is demonstrating the value to other people in the organization, right? Like if your malpractices are just stuff that's going out the door to funders, and no one in your organization is using it, no one's going to have the slightest bit of interest in doing it, and for good reason. It's not making their job easier. They're not learning new things. So yeah, I think that was perfectly put.
Yeah, and on my side, yep, again, well, yes, it has to provide value to others. So for my challenge is that the capacity for different organizations are different in terms of being able to share, as I shared before. The approach that we have was more on, can we capture as a group, the indicators that Columbina was sharing, like in your case, it was for organization, but what are the collective indicators as the group, as civil society in Malaysia that matter for all of us, that we should capture? And then once that's kind of decided, that, at least we know and understand what we're supposed to capture. The next stage is that, unfortunately, because different organizations have different capacity to collect this, sometimes it's nice and says like, okay, can you spend time during your process to submit this, data indicators? But the challenge behind happens when you have such a large group of organizations is then the indicators and the outcome tables become extremely huge. And different organizations will have different capacities in understanding even what to put if you show them such a big table to fill in. So what we've learned then is that it's like, okay, once there's a collective decision on what outcomes we're supposed to track, what indicators we're supposed to track, there needs to be sometimes some sort of person or a team, if possible, that will help fill in the gaps. So if a organization only has capacity to share a link to a resource or an activity that they've done, that's already for me a win. That they share it. It's like, okay, if I share this with this team, I know that somebody's going to capture it and be able to put in the indicators that we've already decided that we should capture. And then of course, for the organizations that have better capacity, you're going to attack the right indicators at the outcomes for the SDGs and so on. And that'll be helpful. So what we've learned is that different organizations have different capacities. If you have a collective shared indicators and outcomes that that you need to go, then you need to be able to support these organizations at the capacities that they're able to be able to make sure that these are captured.
Thanks, all of you. And Kyril, I actually want to turn back to you because we're starting to sort of touch on another question that I had in mind, which was how you can agree on and define key indicators and outcomes. What does that process actually look like? And I'm especially curious to hear from you, Kyril, since you have done that and been through that process through more kind of a collective decision-making process with a larger group of civil society. So I'm curious, Kyril, if you could talk about what that process looks like. And then John and Columbina, I'd be curious if you could talk about it from within your organizations. How do you guys go about defining indicators as well? But Kyril, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, it's a continuous process. Of course, it takes a while. So at least in Malaysia, with the group of civil society organizations, we had some broad overall thematic area first. Called freedom of expression. But even at that large scale level, a lot of the different organizations didn't even understand, like, how do we fit in? Like, what value do we bring into this thing? So the first start was just sharing what the definition of what you're working, that goal towards, that a shared vision of an understanding of what that goal that you're all heading for is first. So that already helps. Then that starts a process where every organization feels it's like, okay, we're part of this process towards this goal. And this is what we think we bring value towards achieving that goal. So that was the first step. Then, of course, the next step then is your typical kind of planning and workshop, where you get everybody who all their different organizations now to say, okay, these are the goals and outcomes that we want to do, and collectively decide as a group of organizations, what are the outcomes that we want to do? Not from a donor perspective, but from within the civil society organizations themselves in Malaysia. What do we want as Malaysians, as civil society organizations? What are the goals that we want to go to? And then, again, we go through one or two, multiple things. The strategic planning workshop, which is kind of standard. And then next to then define the indicators that we should be capturing. And then the capacity for us to even know if we can be able to capture indicators. So now we're at that step where we're kind of defining the indicators and now figuring out how we're going to do this. So yeah, that was our process.
A lengthy process, but it sounds very worth it. I'm curious, Columbina and John, if you have gone through similar things at an organizational level, or if your process to define key indicators has looked different. If you could talk about that, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. Yeah, I think first of all, like, yeah, what Kyril said, it was like excellent. Like, just that part about making sure everyone who's like invested in that process is involved is like absolutely necessary. And then I think for us, a big piece of that is our approach really looks at examining sort of what our solution is and what are those like links and assumptions we're making about that solution leading us towards our goal, and highlighting those as our indicators. So if we assume that running, a series of workshops, I keep going back to workshops, clearly it's my whole life. If a series of workshops are going to build the necessary capacity to support government staff in implementing X, we're making a lot of assumptions about like, hey, like these workshops, they don't just run and then the capacity is built. Like, we're assuming that there's opportunity for municipal or government staff to put into practice the things we're talking about in those workshops. We're also assuming that, hey, these people have shown up to this workshop, so that means that they're interested in this. So they're motivated to do this when they go there. So it's following up on those things. And I'll say that, and like, that's a really hard one to follow up on. Like, I know many people here have sent those Google Forms or whatever surveys after workshops or later on trying to get responses. That's difficult. But it doesn't mean it's not valuable. So for us, a big part of that is like our indicators rest a lot on us maintaining relationships with those people. So when we talk about difficulties of capacity building, right? Like, if our indicators are tied to someone doing their job differently, we're like invested in like following up on that, even if it's a fair bit of work.
Yes, in our case, I will say that it was a trial and error. At the beginning, we were very like everyone do the indicators they want and do something, and it's okay because we were starting this. But then with time, we realized that it was very, very important to have if you have a good institutional strategy and you as a direction give the teams, because they are in their projects like this, like my project, I want to do this, I have to, but you have to give the big picture. So we do this very collectively. In every January we have like an idea of what the year will be, what our main goals. So in terms of these big goals, we say, okay, what do you want to do? And we do it collectively, and then we present to each other. So the others can comment. Maybe I work in advocacy and you work in training and methodologies. So they can comment and they say, oh, this is very interesting, but haven't you thought about, we have also done role playing. So for instance, we have done like, there are funders here, you have to sell them your project and tell them this is what I will achieve and what your goals are. So we try to do it with the bigger picture. At the beginning, although I, for instance, review every spreadsheet and made comments, because you had to train the muscle of making indicators, and some people do it very badly, like they were not real indicators or they lacked some information. Like, and we say, okay, and then we have a meeting and we sit down and say, look, you're not measuring this, you're measuring this. What do you actually want? And how do I do it? Because not everyone is trained in doing this. This is our mindset you have to train. I wasn't either. A colleague told me, and then we started doing this together. So I think this is the way at least we did it, very slowly. But it's very important if you have a shared institutional strategy and shared goals for the next year and for the next 3 years, it makes it much, much easier, because there is it makes like a sense, like why are we doing this? And you have to train it, and then new people come to the organization, and you have to spend some time with them, sit with them and explain, and collectively too, because people working in the methodologies and training are very good at this. Actually, I ask them to help me sometimes or to meet with others. So it's like a shared process.
Thanks. I think you guys each offered a little bit of a unique take on how you define those indicators. I think this final point of having a strong institutional strategy is really important, something that we think about when we design our programming, and we've seen partners thinking about as a really key part of their MEL process as well. I want to turn to a question from the audience, and they have asked, have any of you used or would recommend logic models or a similar framework to help determine your monitoring and evaluation plan? So this is open to anyone who wants to jump in.
I'm happy to go real quick. So I know for us, we sort of lean on the theory of change. I don't know how familiar folks are with that, but similar idea of just sort of plotting out from the start to finish in terms of, this is our problem, this is our proposed solution, this is our goal, and these are the activities that will get us there. And like I mentioned last answer, like throughout that process, there's a lot of assumptions that we try to really encourage people to think about and to plot and to put there on paper, because that helps us look back and like challenge those. And it also includes as well, like we're all working in spaces that are incredibly complex and we're not the only actors in. So it gives us the opportunity to consider the external factors and stakeholders that are influencing our work and influencing the ultimate outcome. So these are both really important, because I know for any of the work that we're doing, we're not like if the outcome we're hoping for is achieved, we know we're not the sole reason that happened. We're hoping for some sort of like, we played a part in that, and a really well-defined, like for us, theory of change that we've tested through MEL really helps prove that at the end. And that's what we want to show to funders. That's what we want to show the public. That's what we want to show with the people we work with. So.
Yeah, I can only add that for me, this was also like a bit of an obsession at the beginning, like what to use, logic models, this kind of, and there was, because we had 2 different board directors and they all gave us training. And one was in these agile methodologies, and the other one is an expert in theories of change, and so they had totally different ways of putting the same information. And the team was very frustrated. They loved the first one and hated the second one, but it was the same, just in a different package. So, and for instance, if you want to, there is a methodology called the Lean Journey, and it's very visual. And it's with an island, and you go to the island, and there is like an iceberg. And our team loved it because it was easier to understand. The other board director was an economist, and he loved huge spreadsheets, and he made them do like a huge theory of change, and it didn't work. So, but the logic is the same. And some, for instance, the European Union, when you apply to funding, they force you to do a logic model, and everyone hates it, and nobody wants to do that part. And it's a way of thinking. And I think what they told me, and because I asked them, like, why are we doing, which is the one? And they said, it's also like, it goes by, like, it's like a fashion. Sometimes it's about logic models, then it's about some different way. But you have to understand the logic behind it and use the one that suits you better, and it's easier for your team to work with. We like the lean journey because for us it's easy to use, but some people didn't like it. And so I think the good thing of this model is that it makes you really go back to your assumptions. It's not so easy to understand at the beginning, but then you have to really think through the project. So I will say that you can use any model, but it has to work.
Yeah, my take on this is they're all helpful. I said they're all going to go to the same goals, but I learned that each one has slightly different benefits and positives. So that's why I use both, or other methods as well if possible. So one of the advantages with doing a logic model is that it's very structured. You have some top level goals, and then you can easily fit in certain things. Okay, this activity goes under here, and so on, like building a building or something. But the challenge for that I found was that it can be very hierarchical and structured. And generally, when people work in NGOs or civil society, you work on a variety of cross-cutting practices that go across the structure, even though you're going towards the same goal. So we found that then you also need a theory of change or a path model or other methods to identify cross-practice areas that work towards the same goal that a logic framework doesn't really capture that much. So as I mentioned in one of the strategic planning workshops that we did, when we did a logic framework, some partners came in and says, like, I don't know where we fit in here. We work on this. We feel that we only work in this small part of this logic framework, and we don't understand how we belong in another part. So yeah, you need both, and or additional tools like what Columbina just shared. I'm going to look at that up, but they all head towards the same goal, and I think that you shouldn't restrict to one. I think you should look at 2 or 3 different things to address different strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. So I want to ask, and I think you all have alluded to this at some points, but I know sometimes understanding failures or things that don't work can be one of the best ways for people to learn. So I'm curious if you all could share, 1 or 2 MEL approaches you've tried that really haven't worked well for you and your organization when you were trying to stand up, more comprehensive MEL collection efforts or even just basic MEL collection efforts. If you could speak to, a failure or approach that really didn't work for your organization, I think that's often really helpful for people to hear.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Starting in where there was really no existing malpractices, and sort of taking that as like, okay, great, I'm just going to do a real top down, just do a big, like, we're going to bring in a new piece of software. This is going to be great. Surprisingly did not work very well, because for all of the reasons that my other panelists have already spoken to, right? Like, overly complex. People didn't see the value in it immediately because, again, like, you're putting in place like this thing where, like, oh, the value will be there like in a year later. It's like, great. And then just a huge additional load of work on everyone's plate. Yeah, I think everyone's like I really loved like early on Columbina's like point about just like really simplifying things. Like I think that was one of the biggest takeaways I took from that, was just like, you know, start small, make it nice and simple, slowly get people in.
Yeah, it's very similar. The first spreadsheet we did, this friend of mine, she's very good at this, but she was very, she came from a very higher standard of a big organization with lots of resources. She did something very complicated, and we have had to meet every 3 months, and people had to fill this in, and it was a. So now it's very simple. Like the next year, I deleted a lot of cells and categories and started to simplify the spreadsheet because I realized that nobody used it if it was so complicated, and also that it didn't take so much time. So also what we did was to have every 3 months a day where we met and we work on the spreadsheet so that people didn't have to do it during their while they were working, and we did it all together. So and they the ones that were better at this helped the ones that didn't understand it so well. But I think it took like 2 or 3 years to get this working. Like at the beginning, it was difficult, and people didn't like it, and so it's not like an easy thing to do. It was not like a success story from the beginning that oh we are doing mail practices. It takes a lot of work, and you have to be also like understanding, because as John and Kahir have said, people don't have time to do this or resources. We are NGOs, we always are overworked, and we need more staff, so it's not something that you can start like pushing people to do it.
Yeah, like what Colomina shared. When I try to simplify certain forms, like just basic reporting forms, I thought I simplified it enough. I had like little guides and just do this and paste this. And first feedback, everybody just came back to me. It's like, this is too much. I'm not going to report on this. And just basically, and these are partners that I'm friends with, right? And who themselves understand, as they're just stressed out, as Shafina mentioned, right? So yeah, so for me, it's understanding the capacity of your partners on what they're able to do. Sometimes, we're talking about Mel and indicators. Sometimes for me, what I learned was sometimes for some organizations, the capacity is just at the basic level, in the cycle of just capturing activities and outputs. It's not, maybe it's still at a level of resources. So, like, what are you doing? And maybe that's a good start for them enough, depending on their ability. And then of course, and then if for those that are be able to help out, then they can do it at a higher level. It's like, okay, we have all these resources, like what indicators are they going towards to, and so on. So for me, understanding the capacity and what I've learned is as well is that, if the partner capacity is just to give you a link through a WhatsApp or Signal message about something that they've done, that's already a win for me in terms of monitoring. Like they've, in their, crazy situation of dealing with, death threats and so on, I can just share you this link and some photos of this event, and that's okay. So for me, that's what I've learned is like, understand the capacity of each of your partners. And when you're asking for these things, be aware of that. And then, yeah, see how you can help. We've already said this, like, how can it be beneficial? And if that link, you're able to, add indicators or capture the report better or what they're doing, then that gives them a benefit for the capacity that they're able to. So yeah, that was my lesson. It's like, not to get everybody to hate you for asking for things, and that's always the challenge. Yep.
I think that's an honest and a fair way to represent Mel at times. It can feel like a real balance between trying to collect this very important data and also getting people not to resent you in the process, and striking that balance, I think, is often the key to really successful Mel efforts. So I know we are right at the end of time here. I want to thank all three of you for joining us in this panel. I know you guys are in varying time zones, all of which are late. So thank you for taking the time to share your experiences, your lessons learned. I personally learned a lot just from listening to you all share how you've approached Mel over the years. So thanks everyone for listening in. Hopefully you also learned something too. And I think that's it. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.